Today, we are diving into one of the most incredible periods of cultural change in all of history, the English Renaissance. We're going to explore how, after 1,000 years of collective faith and rigid social structures, the very idea of the individual as we know it was born. So, to really get what a huge deal this was, you have to understand where England was coming from. You know, the medieval world was all about the group. It was feudal, it was collective, and it was built on unquestioning faith. You as an individual, well, you didn't really matter as much. But the Renaissance, it flipped all of that completely on its head. Suddenly, the spotlight swung onto the individual, onto human potential, and onto the power of asking questions. It was like a complete rewiring of society's operating system. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll see how the new age said goodbye to the old one. Then we'll get into the real engines that powered this massive change. After that, we'll look at how individual people started finding their voice, how the sonnet became the perfect way to express it, and finally, we'll unpack the lasting legacy of it all. First up, breaking from the past. Because, before you can really build a new world, you kind of have to acknowledge that the old one is ending. What's so interesting is that some of the very first writings of the Renaissance were actually looking backward. Take Sir Thomas Malory's Morte Arthur. It came out in 1485, and it's this huge, epic story about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. But here's the thing. It wasn't a celebration of the present. It was really a fond, kind of sad farewell, an elegy, really, to that whole dying world of knights and chivalry. It shows us that people at the time knew they were standing at a major turning point, literally closing the book on an entire era. Okay, so that leads us right into our next section. If the old world was fading out, what exactly was giving birth to the new one? What were the engines driving this new era? Yeah, what did create this new spirit? It's really the central question of the Renaissance. I mean, was it one person, one single invention, one big idea that changed everything? Well, the answer is no. The spirit of an age is never just one thing, is it? It was more like a confluence of powerful forces all hitting at the exact same time. You had this new philosophy called humanism, the game-changing invention of the printing press, mind-blowing scientific discoveries, and a rediscovery of all the brilliant ideas from ancient Greece and Rome. All together, they created the perfect storm for change. Let's just zero in on humanism for a second, because this is really the intellectual core of the whole Renaissance. For centuries, life was focused almost entirely on God and the afterlife. Humanism didn't get rid of that, but it brought the focus back down to Earth. It said, hey, what about us? What about human potential, our ability to think, the value of our experiences right here, right now? It basically gave people permission to be curious about themselves and the world again. And that brings us to the machine that made it all possible. The printing press. Just think about it. Before 1476, every single book had to be copied by hand. It was incredibly slow, and books were super rare and expensive. Then, bam! William Caxton brings the printing press to England. All of a sudden, you can make hundreds, even thousands of copies. That meant new ideas, like humanism, could spread like wildfire. It was, no exaggeration, the internet of its day. So when you have this explosion of ideas, all focused on the individual, well, what happens next is pretty logical. It leads us straight to our third section. People started finding their own unique voices, and they began to question, well, everything. Just listen to this question from a writer named Julian of Norwich. She asks, essentially, if God is so good, then why is there evil in the world? Now, for us, that's a classic philosophical question. But back then, in the late medieval world, to even ask that, to question the way things are, that took an incredible amount of intellectual courage. It was a sign that the human mind was starting to break free. And Julian wasn't the only one. She and another amazing writer, Marjorie Kemp, were really voices of this new age. While Julian was questioning religious ideas, Kemp was doing something just as revolutionary. She wrote the very first autobiography in the English language. Think about that. Her work was deeply personal, all about her own life, her own experiences. This turn inward, this focus on the self, it became the blueprint for what we now call confessional writing. Okay, so you've got all these new ideas floating around about being an individual and exploring your personal experience. You need a form to put all that into, right? That brings us to section 4 and how the sonnet absolutely took England by storm. Now, the sonnet wasn't an English invention. Its story really starts back in 14th century Italy with a poet named Petrarch. He perfected this short 14-line poem. and he used it to explore all the intense, personal, messy feelings of love. It took a couple hundred years, but in the early 1500s, English poets like Wyatt and Surrey brought the form home with them. And the timing couldn't have been more perfect. It landed right as the Elizabethan Golden Age was about to kick off. But here's the cool part. The English poets didn't just copy and paste. They made it their own. The original Italian form is basically in two parts. You have 8 lines to present a problem or a question, and then 6 lines to resolve it. But the English, or what we now call the Shakespearean sonnet, they changed the structure. It uses 3 4-line stanzas to build and develop an idea, and then it ends with this powerful 2-line punchline, a couplet that delivers a final thought or a clever twist. And once it arrived in England, this thing just exploded. Seriously, it was like a sonnet fever swept the country. It became the ultimate test for any serious poet. If you wanted to prove you had what it takes, you had to write a sonnet sequence. Not just one poem, but a whole collection, usually about love. It was a full-on literary competition. And this competition, it produced some of the greatest poetry in the English language, period. You had Sir Philip Sidney with Astrophil and Stella, Edmund Spenser with his Amoretti, and of course the master himself, William Shakespeare. He wrote this incredible sequence of 154 sonnets that dig into love, beauty, time, you name it. These poets weren't just writing nice little poems. They were using this tiny, compact form to do deep psychological explorations of what it means to be human. So, what does this all add up to? What's the bottom line? Let's bring it all together in our final section and talk about the lasting legacy of this incredible time. Okay, if you take away one thing from all this, let it be this. The English Renaissance was so much more than just great art and literature. It was quite literally the birth of the modern individual. It was this fundamental, seismic shift from a world where your identity was just your place in the group to a world that championed personal expression, intellectual curiosity, and the absolutely boundless potential of the human mind. And this leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? The Renaissance was shaped by this perfect storm of forces: humanism, technology, rediscovering old ideas. So it makes you wonder, what are the forces shaping the spirit of our age right now? What is our printing press? What's our humanism? It's definitely a question worth thinking about. Thanks for digging into this with us.